Mail-order bride lied she was never married. She had 3 children waiting in the next town. The letter smelled like lavender. I remember that because nothing in my house smelled like anything good anymore, and I held it longer than I should have before I opened it. Her name was Cecilia Marsh, widow of Harlan Marsh, cattle agent, dead of a lung fever 2 winters prior. She hadn't put that in the letter. She'd put, 29 years old, fair health, capable with a household, willing to relocate to the right situation. Her handwriting was small and even the kind a woman learns when she's been taught that taking up too much space is a fault. I'd answered the advertisement in late October. It was Judge Pershing who suggested it, not unkindly, after he saw me eating crackers and a can of peaches for supper at the livery while my own stove sat cold at home. He said, "Emmett, a man needs a reason to cook." I didn't argue. I was 61 years old and I had stopped arguing about most things. The agency in St. Louis handled the correspondence, and I wrote 3 letters over 6 weeks and she wrote 3 back. And by December we had agreed I would send fare for a coach to Renner, which was the nearest town of any size to my property. 140 acres of hard-won grassland, 12 miles northwest, good water. A sound house I'd built myself and kept in better repair than I kept myself. I told her in the 3rd letter about my hip, which had been shot through 20 years prior and left me with a hitch in my walk that got worse in the cold. I told her because I didn't want a woman arriving expecting one thing and finding another. She wrote back, "I have seen worse. I am not afraid of a man who has been broken and kept going." I read that sentence 4 or 5 times. She arrived on a Tuesday in the 1st week of January. I was at the depot in Renner with the wagon. It had snowed 2 days before and the streets were packed gray and hard, and I'd been standing there in the cold long enough that my hip had gone nearly useless, and I was leaning against the wagon wheel when the coach came in. There were 5 passengers, 3 men and 2 women. I knew right off which one was her because she came down the coach steps carrying a carpet bag and looking around with the particular expression of a woman who has made a decision she intends to stand behind. Not confident, exactly. More like someone who has already done the hard part, the deciding, and now is just executing. She was brown-haired, brown-eyed, with a mouth that looked like it had been pressed closed against saying something too many times. Handsome. Not the word I'd use on purpose, but it came anyway. I raised my hand and she walked toward me through the gray snow and held out her hand like a man would and said, "Emmett Cal." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Cecilia Marsh, I have to tell you something before we go any further." I thought, here it is. Some defect she saved for in person. She said it plainly, the way she did most things. She had 3 children, a boy of 8, a girl of 6, a boy of 4. They were in Hatchet, the next town west, staying with her late husband's sister, who had run out of goodwill and said she needed them gone by end of the month. She had not disclosed this in the letters because she had been afraid I would refuse outright, and she needed this to work. She was sorry for the deception. She would understand if I put her back on the coach today, and she meant that. She wouldn't beg and she wouldn't cry, but she needed me to know she was a mother before she was a wife, and that wasn't going to change, and I had to make my decision with full knowledge. She stood there in the cold and watched me. I have had a fair number of moments in my life where I had to decide something fast and live with it slow. This was one. I thought about the house. It had 4 rooms. I thought about the land. It fed more than one man had ever managed. I thought about those 3 children who hadn't asked to be orphaned, half and shuttled and held in a borrowed house on borrowed time. And I thought about this woman who had taken a very large gamble and now stood here in the snow not begging, not weeping, just watching me with those press-closed eyes and waiting. I said, "How far is Hatchet?" She said, 11 miles. I said, "We'll get them tomorrow. Tonight we'll eat supper and you can tell me about them." She didn't say anything for a second. Then she picked up her carpet bag and put it in the wagon herself and climbed up without help, which with the ice was harder than it looked. I climbed up my side slow because of the hip, and she didn't watch me struggle and didn't look away either. She just sat facing front. We drove the 12 miles mostly in quiet. She asked about the land, and I told her about the water situation and the 2 horses and the cattle, which numbered 16 at last count, and had wintered well. She listened the way a person listens when they actually want to know. The house was warm. I'd banked the stove before I left. She walked through it once without saying anything, and then she said, "It's a good house." Then she put her bag down in the 2nd room. I'd said she'd have the 2nd room. We'd sort the rest after. and came back out and asked where I kept the flour. We ate cornbread and salt pork, and she made a gravy out of almost nothing that was better than anything I'd cooked in 2 years. We sat at the table, and she told me about the children. Thomas was the 8-year-old, solemn, good with his hands. Nora was the 6-year-old, talkative, opinionated. Little Cal, she called him Little Cal, was 4, and had his father's red hair and the temperament of a small horse that has decided it is in charge. She said all this matter-of-factly, not selling them, just presenting them. Like, here is what I come with, take it whole or don't take it. I told her I'd had a son. He'd died at 4, a fever, long time ago now. His mother had gone 2 years after. I hadn't talked about that and I didn't know how long. She didn't say she was sorry or that it must have been hard. She said, what was his name? I said, James. She said, that's a good name. We didn't talk much after that. I went to bed early because I could tell she needed the quiet to settle herself and I needed the dark to think. I lay there a long while. I'd come into this arrangement looking for a reason to cook, as Pershing said, something to organize a day around. I was not unaware that I had been, for some months, moving through my life in the way a clock runs down, still making the motions, but without much conviction. I didn't say that to myself in exactly those words. But I knew the supper of crackers and peaches was not really about laziness. It was about not caring enough to do it right. I got up before first light and fed the horses. When I came back and she was already up and had coffee going, and she handed me a cup without asking how I took it, and it was right. I don't know how she knew. I drank it at the window watching the sky go pink at the bottom, and she stood at the stove, and I thought, whatever this is, it's not what I expected. And I'd stopped expecting much. So that was something. We drove to Hatchet the next morning, cold but clear. The roads were better than the day before. I'll tell you what I remember about meeting those children. I remember Harlan Marsh's sister, stout woman, tight face, the look of someone who has been generous past their limit and knows it, opening the door and 3 children being arranged behind her in the hallway like they'd been warned to stand still. Thomas with his arms at his sides, jaw set. Nora pressing into the wall. Little Cal with his red hair and his finger in his mouth. Cecilia went in and knelt down right there in the hallway without waiting for an invitation, and little Cal came to her immediately, flung his arms around her neck. And Thomas and Nora moved in after a second, slowly, the way children do when they've been trying very hard not to need something. I stood in the doorway. The sister looked at me. She said, "You're the husband." I said, "I'm Emmett Cal. We'll take the children today if that suits." She said it suited fine. She looked relieved, which is a hard thing to judge a person for. We loaded what they had, which wasn't much, into the wagon bed. Thomas lifted boxes without being asked. I noticed that. I also noticed the way he watched me, sizing me up the way a boy does when he's been the man of the household and isn't sure what to do with a man appearing. I didn't try to win him over. I just handed him the next box to load, and he took it. On the drive back, Nora talked almost the entire way. She had questions. How many horses did I have? Did I have a dog? What did I grow? Why did my leg hurt? What was the house like? I answered each one straight. The dog question? I didn't have one, I told her. But the barn had a cat that had been there when I bought the place and would probably outlive all of us, and she found this deeply satisfying. Little Cal fell asleep against his mother before we'd gone 4 miles. Thomas sat up front with me. For a long time he didn't say anything. Then he said, "Are you going to be good to her?" I kept my eyes on the road. I said, "I aim to." He thought about that. Then he said, "My father wasn't always." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything, which I think was right. That first week was not easy. 4 people in a house built for one changes things you don't anticipate. The noise alone, I'd lived in near silence for years, and suddenly there was a small red-headed person demanding to know where his cup was at 6 in the morning. Nora had nightmares 2 of the first 3 nights, and Cecilia would go to her, and I would lie in the dark listening and not sleeping. Thomas broke one of my good cups and looked like he was bracing for something that didn't come. And when I just said to sweep it up, he stood there another second like he wasn't sure the conversation was over. I didn't know children anymore. I'd known one child and then I hadn't. I moved carefully around them like a man in unfamiliar terrain. Cecilia watched this without comment. She had a way of not making a person feel observed even when she was clearly observing. The second week, a thing happened. It had snowed again, bad, 2 feet in 2 days, and I'd gone out early to break ice on the water trough and clear the barn path. My hip seized up about halfway through. Bad. I managed to get back to the porch, but I couldn't get up the steps. I just sat down on the bottom step in the snow and waited for it to pass, which it sometimes did and sometimes didn't. She appeared at the door. She'd been watching, I found out later, from the window. She came down the steps and she didn't say anything, just put herself beside me and got under my arm, and between the two of us I made it up the steps and into the kitchen and into the chair. She put my leg up on the second chair and went and heated water without making it into anything more than what it was. A man who needed help and a woman who provided it. After a while she said, "You should have woken me." I said, "I've managed before." She said, "I know you have. I'm here now." I looked at her. She was at the stove, her back to me, and something in those 4 words, "I'm here now," settled in my chest in a way I hadn't felt since I couldn't remember when. Not pity, not sympathy, not even kindness exactly. More like, this is the arrangement and I mean it, and you don't have to manage everything alone because that was before and this is now. I didn't say anything. I looked at the fire through the stove grate and my hip slowly unclenched, and I thought about James, which I don't do often because when I do it tends to stay with me all day. I thought about the years between then and now, the slow subtraction of everything, the crackers and peaches, the cold stove. Then little Cal came in from the other room dragging a blanket and put it over my legs without being asked and went back out. He was 4 years old. He'd seen his mother tend something and he'd decided to join in. I had to look away. February. Thomas had started coming with me to the barn in the mornings. It started because he appeared one morning in his coat while I was pulling boots on and just stood there, and I said, "Grab that other bucket," and he did, and after that it was a thing we did. He didn't talk much in the mornings. Neither did I. We got along fine. He was 8 years old and strong for it. He had his father's name, but I was beginning to think not much else of his father's. He was careful and honest, and when he made a mistake, he owned it without drama and tried again. He reminded me of what I'd wanted to be at that age. One morning in the barn, working in the dim before sunrise, he said without preamble, "Did you have kids before?" I said, "One, a boy, he died young." He worked that over for a bit. Then he said, "Were you sad for a long time?" I said, "Still am some. But it gets to where you can carry it without it stopping you." He nodded like that was the answer he'd been looking for and went back to forking hay. I don't know what he was working through. I didn't ask. But I thought about it afterward, the way he'd wanted to know if loss could be survived, if a man could keep going inside it, and I thought whatever his father had or hadn't been, this boy was going to be all right. Cecilia and I had been married by Judge Pershing at the house on the 14th of January, just the 2 of us and the 3 children and old Pershing and his wife. It was not romantic. Nora thought it should be more ceremonial and said so. Little Cal was unimpressed by the whole proceeding. Thomas watched me say the words with that measuring look of his, and after it was done he shook my hand, which I hadn't expected. Cecilia wore her good dress, dark blue, and her hair pinned up, and she looked at me when she said her part with an expression that was not starry-eyed and was not reluctant either. It was clear, like a person who has looked at a situation from every angle and made their choice and is now making it out loud. I said my part and meant it. We shook hands with Pershing, and his wife had brought a cake, and Nora decided that was sufficient ceremony after all. She told me about Harlan Marsh in pieces over the following weeks. Not in a single conversation, but in the way things come out when you're living alongside someone, something small will start it. A word, the way I said a thing, and another piece would come loose. He had not been a violent man, she was careful to say that. He had been a diminishing man, a man who made her smaller by steady degrees, who decided what she knew and what she didn't, who let her understand reliably that she was fortunate to have him and wouldn't do better. She had believed it for a while, the way you do when a thing is said enough. Then he was gone, and she'd spent the first months just learning to think in her own direction again. She told me this like it was a practical matter, not looking for sympathy. More like, here is the territory you're in with me, so you know where not to step. I listened. I asked her after, was there anything I did that put her in mind of him? She thought about it. She said, "You went quiet when I made the gravy wrong that Thursday." I said the gravy was fine. I was quiet because my hip was bad. She said, "I know that now." I said, if I go quiet, it's the hip, or I'm tired, or I'm thinking. I'll tell you which. She looked at me for a second. She said, all right. We sat with that, and after a while she said, he used to say I talk too much. I said, I like hearing you. She turned and looked at the window. I couldn't see her face. After a moment she said, that's a fine thing for a man to say. It wasn't meant to be fine, it was just true, but I didn't say that. Some things you don't need to explain. March came and the snow started losing its grip on things. The mud season, bad that year, worse in the low parts of the property where the water ran when the snowpack went. I was out most days working on drainage, a thing I'd been putting off because it was mostly work for two, and I'd been one for a long time. Thomas came with me most days. He was learning to work a proper line of drainage from higher ground to lower, which is not complicated but requires paying attention to what the land is telling you. He paid attention. He had the quality, which not everyone does, of watching something until he understood it rather than guessing and going. One afternoon we were working a stretch near the north fence when he stopped and said, "Is this going to be my home?" I kept working for a second because I wanted to say the right thing. I said, "It's your home now if you want it." He looked at the land. He said, "I didn't want to come here." I said, "I know." He said, "I thought you'd be like him." I said, "Was I?" He thought about it seriously. He said, "No." We kept working. After a while he said, "I like the barn in the morning." I said, "So do I." That was about all. But that evening when we came in and Cecilia was at the stove and little Cal was underfoot and Nora was telling a complicated story about the barn cat that required a great deal of hand motion, Thomas sat down at the table and looked around at all of it, just looked. The way kids sometimes do when they've decided something, and I saw it settle on him. The place, the house, the ordinary noise of it. April. I woke at 3 in the morning with a pain in my chest that scared me. Not the hip, the chest. I lay in the dark and breathed through it, and after 20 minutes or so it faded to a pressure and then to nothing, and I lay there in the nothing and thought, so that's how it might be. I didn't go back to sleep. I got up at first light and went to the barn and did the morning work, and when I came in Cecilia looked at me and said, "What happened?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "Emmett." That was all she said, my name, but the way she said it, not demanding, not afraid, just, "I see you and I'm asking." I sat down at the table and told her about the pain. She sat across from me. She didn't panic. She asked me questions in a practical way. Had this happened before? Did I have shortness of breath? What did it feel like exactly? When I'd told her all of it, she sat quiet for a minute. Then she said, "You'll go see the doctor in Renner this week." I said it was probably nothing. She looked at me, not with fear exactly, with something closer to, I don't know the exact word for it, steadiness. The same thing I'd felt from her that morning on the porch steps. You don't have to manage everything alone because that was before. She said, "You are not going to check out on me, Emmett, Cal. I need you here." I looked at her. She said, "Those children need you. Thomas would be lost without the barn mornings. Little Cal sleeps better since you're in the house. I don't know why, but he does. Nora's been calling you Papa for 6 weeks, and I don't think you've noticed." I hadn't. I sat with that. She said, "And I need you, so you'll go to Renner." Her hands were flat on the table. I put mine over them. She turned her hand and held mine. She has a strong grip, which I'd noticed before, but she wasn't gripping now. She was just holding. The two hands together on the table in the morning light coming through the east window. The stove ticking. The house quiet because the children weren't up yet. I said, "I'll go Thursday." She said, "Wednesday." I almost smiled. I said, "Wednesday." The doctor in Renner was a young man named Haverhill who had the earnest quality of someone who read everything ever written and had yet to be surprised by the world. He listened to my chest for a long time. He asked the same questions Cecilia had asked. He sat back and said there were things he couldn't know without more equipment than he had, but that my heart sounded, as he put it, tired but working. He said, "You've had a hard life in your body. These things accumulate." I said, "I know that." He said, "Moderate your activity. Don't push through the bad days, and stop carrying everything alone." I said, "I'm not anymore." He looked at me with something like professional interest. He said, "Recent change." I said, "January." He said, "Good." I drove back. The day was clean and pale, early spring, the kind of day that doesn't commit to anything yet but hints at what's coming. I could smell the wet grass starting up on the low parts where the snow had gone. I thought about what he'd said, tired but working. I thought that was about right for most of what I was. May, the land came back. The cattle were ranging well. I had taken on a seasonal hand, a young Mexican man named Flores who was quiet and skilled and needed no supervision, which was what I could afford to give. The drainage work Thomas and I had done held through the melt. The north pasture grass was coming in thick. I built a second sleeping room off the back of the house. I'd been planning it anyway, but now there was a reason to finish. Thomas and little Cal had been sharing, which Thomas bore with the long-suffering dignity of an 8-year-old who considers himself practically an adult, and Nora had been in the small storeroom, which was warm but cramped. The new room would fix that. Thomas helped me frame it. He was steady with a hammer, and he learned the measuring without needing to be told twice. His hands were starting to show the calluses of real work. I noticed that he'd stopped flinching when I moved quickly or raised my voice over the noise. In the early weeks, he'd had a reflex I recognized as learned, a small bracing. It was mostly gone now. The day we put up the last wall, he stood back and looked at it and said, "We built that." I said we did. He looked at me sideways and then away, the way boys do when they feel something they aren't sure they're allowed to. One evening in late May, Cecilia and I sat on the porch after the children were in bed. The dark came on slow the way it does that time of year, and the frogs were going down at the creek, and she had her coffee and I had mine, and we sat without needing to fill the quiet. After a while she said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "All right." She said, "When I wrote those letters, I was terrified. I wrote down what I thought a man would want to read, and I left out the most important thing. And every mile on that coach, I thought about it. I thought about the children waiting in Hatchet, and I thought about arriving and telling you, and I thought you would be angry. Most men would have been." I said I wasn't angry. She said, "I know. That surprised me more than anything." I looked out at the dark coming in. I said, "Why didn't you put it in the letters?" She said, "Because every time I'd tried to start over since Harlan, as soon as there were children to explain, the conversation ended. I was a burden. The children were a burden. And I was running out of time and options, and I thought," she stopped and looked at her coffee, "I thought if you met me first, and saw that I wasn't a woman looking to take from you, but a woman willing to work alongside you, then maybe the children could be known as people instead of liabilities." I sat with that for a while. I said, "They are known as people." She said quietly, "I know that now." I looked at her in the half-dark, and I thought about the letter that smelled like lavender, and the depot in January with the gray-packed snow, and her coming down the coach steps with her carpet bag and her decision already made, and saying, "I have to tell you something before we go any further." I said, "For what it's worth, I think you read me right." She said, "I did, eventually. I wasn't sure at first." I said, "Were you scared that first night?" She said, "Yes, were you?" I said, "Yes." She laughed a little, not a big laugh, just the quiet kind. She said, "We're a pair." I said, "I think we are." She reached over and put her hand on my arm without looking at me, still looking out at the dark and the frog sounds and the first stars coming on in the south, and she left it there. Just the weight of it. A hand on an arm, the simplest possible thing. I put my hand over hers. The frogs kept on, the stars filled in. Somewhere in the house, little Cal called out once in his sleep and then was quiet, and neither of us moved. And after a while I realized I'd stopped thinking about the chest pain and the hip and the used-up feeling I'd been carrying around since I couldn't remember when. And I was just sitting there in the May dark with a woman's hand on my arm, and the sounds of a house full of people who were, against all the odds of how things tend to go, mine. Thomas turned 9 in June. Cecilia made a cake. Nora had decided she was in charge of decorating it, which resulted in something that tasted better than it looked. Little Cal ate so much frosting he had to lie down. I gave Thomas a good folding knife, my father's, one of the few things I still had from before everything. It had a bone handle and a good blade, and I'd carried it most of my life. I told him it was a working knife and he should use it like one, not save it. He opened it and looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket very carefully, the way you do with something you've decided matters, and said, "Thank you, Emmett." He still didn't call me Papa. That was all right. What he called me was my name, and he said it straight and without any qualification, which was its own thing. I went back to see Haverhill in August. He listened to my chest again and asked the same questions, and at the end he said, "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." I said, "I have a family now." He said, "That's it then." I drove home. The land was summer dry, and the sky was high and pale, and the grass smelled like itself the way it does in heat. I turned off the main road at the post oak I'd been using as a marker for 15 years and came down the long slope toward the house. I could see the house from a quarter-mile out, the smoke from the chimney, the horses in the south pen. I could see, small at this distance, a figure in the kitchen garden, Cecilia, from the way she moved, doing something with the bean rows. I could see Thomas near the barn. Little Cal was probably underfoot somewhere. Nora was probably narrating something to the barn cat. I stopped the wagon on the slope and just looked. 15 years on that property alone, thinking it was enough. Thinking the land and the work and the solitude were what a man had to expect after a certain point, when too much had been used up. Thinking the best days were history. I looked at the smoke from my chimney and the figure in my garden and the boy near my barn, and I thought, "Emmett, you damn fool. Look what was possible." I clicked the horses on down the slope. She looked up when I came through the gate. She had dirt on her hands and her hair coming loose from its pins, and she looked at me the way she'd been looking at me for months now, direct, no performance, just taking me in, and said, "How'd it go?" I said, "He says keep doing what I'm doing." She went back to the beans. She said, "I could have told you that." I got down from the wagon and tied the horses and walked over to the garden. My hip was decent that day. I stood at the fence and watched her work, the efficient way she moved through the rows, the set of her back. She didn't look up, but she knew I was there. After a while she said, "Are you going to stand there all day?" I said, "Might." She stood up straight and looked at me with those steady eyes and something that was almost a smile at the corner of her mouth. She said, "Then make yourself useful." I opened the gate and went in.